Welcome to Theory Underground. What you're about to hear is a lecture that we're making freely available from Intro to Theory, which is a year-long course at Theory Underground that I am teaching. This is a guest lecture I'm very excited to share with you. Hope that you'll enjoy. If you want to get involved, become a subscriber at Theory Underground /subscribe. But before we get started, I want to tell you about something exciting. I made a game. It's called Canon TCG, which stands for trading card games. So it's the Canon, the liberal arts trading card game. First of its kind, collectible, playable, lots of fun. But as Matthew Stanley says here, it's not just a game. It is a technology for social engagement and a whole new way of learning. If that's interesting to you, you might want to be there for Canon Fest at the end of August. That'll be your opportunity to get your hands on the first edition cards in this game, play with a bunch of people who are into philosophy, theory, literature, science, math, and alternative approaches to education. And it will be happening simultaneous to TUCon 2026, the Theory Underground Conference. If you want to be there for that, it's a family-friendly event. Get involved now. Apply today. The form is in the description of this video as well as in the pinned comment. Hope to see you there. All right, so before we get to it, just remember, the game that I made is called Canon TCG. It's gonna be awesome. You can support it, you can get involved now. Canon Fest is at the end of August. You're probably gonna wanna be there. All right, now let's get to it. All right, everybody, welcome to Intro to Theory. We have a guest lecture today from Dr. Iain Thomson from University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And I'm really excited to have him here with us. He's a good friend of the channel. And this will be the first sort of student-focused intro theory we've gotten from him after having had many interviews. So this is very exciting and a total honor. And we're happy to have you here, Iain. I want to apologize for my bad service. My face is probably frozen on a really corny expression. And so I'll get off of this thing and just turn it over to you. Everyone, please put together your literal and figurative hands for Dr. Iain Thomson, his lecture on Intro to Derrida.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here. Happy to be talking about my old teacher, Jacques Derrida. So he's a little hard to introduce. He's kind of famous for resisting summary. One of my many favorite anecdotes about him is that this guy, a student of his, who's a very famous literary theorist now, Jeffrey Bennington, wanted to write a book about explaining Derrida, simplifying Derrida. It's called Jacques Derrida, creatively enough, and wanted Derrida to write the foreword to it. And Derrida said he'd be happy to do it as long as Bennington turned in the introductory text to him ahead of time and then didn't revise it after he wrote a piece that couldn't be explained in terms of Bennington's explanation. And so Bennington does this typical, philosophical explanation. Well, not typical. It's a clear, interesting sort of examination of Derrida's thought, and then Derrida in the you can see them I'll show you just a standard page. So the pages are like 3/4 Bennington's explanation of Derrida, and then Derrida's running commentary on the bottom. It's not exactly commentary. It's one of my favorite Derridian texts. It's called Circumfession, which is he's reading St. Augustine's Confessions at the bedside of his dying mother. And he set himself a kind of philosophical meditational exercise where every time he went to visit her, he had a little Apple computer, and it was back in the early days of Apple Computer, and you could start writing a paragraph, and if your paragraph got too long, it would put up a warning sign, and you'd have to like hit OK to keep going. So his meditational exercise was very much like an art performance piece. He would write something, in response to this dual situation of reading St. Augustine's Confessions, which is about, in part, St. Augustine's relation to his mother, Monica. Derrida's mother's named Monica, and at the bedside of his dying mother in the hospital. And I think it was in the hospital. I'm not positive about that actually. And so he'd write these almost aphoristic responses, and then when the warning light came up, he'd stop. And he would keep writing them until she died. So it's filled with these, fascinating, interesting, brilliant little asides that present this text, Circumfessions, which is sort of like his confession to being circumcised, i.e., his confession to being Jewish, and how his Judaism escaped Bennington's presentation of him, and how he often called himself a Marrano, which was like a secret Jew, a Jewish person who practiced their religion under the guise of Catholicism after the Inquisition, and the in Spain, where they'd made it basically impossible to be Jewish, and yet there were people who carried on in secret. And Derrida was kind of suggesting a kind of philosophical or spiritual or even almost religious affinity with these secret Jewish thinkers who carried on their Judaism in a form that was no longer recognizable from the outside as Judaism, hence a secret Judaism. He thought about the secret a lot. I recently saw Bennington at the APA. I was just got back from the Central APA, and I wondered if he'd learned his lesson about the impossibility of summarizing Derrida. And I don't know. I never got a chance to ask him about it. But there was a session on Levinas's third great book, and Bennington said, "Well, if Derrida was here, he would say," and he proceeded to say something. And I thought, no, he's still he's still trying to speak for Derrida. And the sad thing is, nobody could speak for Derrida. I mean, there was another friend of mine had the idea this was back in the 1980s, we should download Derrida's neural net into the computer so that he can be preserved for the future, because actually there's no more creative, spontaneous genius. I mean, Derrida had this incredible, unbelievable genius for just responding to whatever you presented him with in a way like he would just first want to know you weren't messing with him and what you weren't making a joke out of him. But if you could ask him the craziest question you could think of. My friend asked him what Hegel was doing with his left hand while he wrote the Phenomenology with his right hand, and if Derrida could relate that to themes of mastery and masturbation. And Derrida once he saw that my friend was serious, which he was, then he gave him a big long answer. So he was happy to, just give his thoughts on any variety of topics as long as he could come up with something. And he very rarely repeated himself. He's not like, he didn't have the cut and paste problem of a lot of contemporary thinkers. He would do something like, if you look at his definitions of deconstruction, which is probably the idea he's most famous for, he never defines it the same way twice. It's quite brilliant. So, he gives all these, the experience of the impossible is my favorite Derridian definition, so-called, of deconstruction. Deconstruction is an experience of the impossible. Anyway, so that idea of Derrida as a secret Jewish thinker nicely connects to this question of Heidegger and his relationship to Heidegger. And so he called himself a Heideggerian. And like, I remember talking to him in office hours, and I said something to him like, "Well, I'm trying to be sympathetic to Heidegger here." And he said, "Well, so am I." So he always took himself to be a sympathetic critic. Somebody told him, and I think it was actually misleading, but a philosopher brought to Heidegger a bunch of Derrida's books, and Heidegger thanked that philosopher in a letter. And then that philosopher told Derrida, it was kind of a telephone game series of transmission errors where that philosopher who had given Heidegger Derrida's books said Heidegger was really impressed by your work. He wanted to know who you are. And I don't know how much of that is true. I suspect it was mostly Heidegger being polite because I doubt he'd looked at the books yet. And but Derrida, as a result, felt like Heidegger was reading him. So even the most critical stuff he writes about Heidegger, and he can be very, very critical, he wrote with the thought that Heidegger would be reading it, and he wanted to make sure it was defensible and not polemical. There's a famous line in Foucault where Foucault says, when I open a book and it's just engaging in a polemic, polemos means war, it's just waging war against another thinker, I close it again because I have nothing to learn there. You don't learn anything from reading somebody explaining why they hate something. It's like a lesson if you're ever on an airplane and this doesn't happen in the age of headphones. It used to happen all the time where you got stuck in like a 4 hour conversation with a stranger, and it was often quite painful. And the thing my advice was always like, get the person to talk about something they love, because it's completely uninteresting to hear a person complain and talk about all the things they hate. It's very rarely insightful unless they're a professional critic, and even then, half the time not. You're much more likely to get a deep critique from someone who loves something than someone who hates it. Anyway, so his debt to Heidegger's immense. In his one of his final interviews, he talked about his life of reading Heidegger as if he'd done nothing else. And there are books that, hardly engage with Heidegger, but I don't know if there's a single book that doesn't mention Heidegger somewhere. So he's sort of part of that is like Jean-Paul Sartre was such a huge figure for Derrida's generation that in a dominating presence, if you think of like Sartre's funeral with whatever it was, 3 million people marching through Paris, this was a kind of like intellectual celebrity of an order that's unimaginable in the US. And to grow up under that was to try and find some way through and beyond it. And one of Derrida's ways was to go back to Heidegger and kind of it's like going back to grandpa in order to critique dad. And this led to some of the stuff that Derrida's famous for on anti-humanism, as it's often called, somewhat unfairly. Um, we can talk about that too. But so his most famous idea, deconstruction, is as he himself says, he didn't coin the term. Heidegger coined the term. So Heidegger uses the term destruction. I'll put it in the chat here since I don't have a blackboard. Destruction with a K is the German word, and in German there's a word for destruction. It's Zerstörung, and the word destruction doesn't mean destruction. So with it's as Heidegger explains in a later essay, it's from the Latin destruere, and struere means to lay, pile, or build. So the that's Heidegger's that's his synonym for deconstruction, for destruction is abbauen, unbuilding, deconstructing. And Derrida, in translating and explaining Heidegger's explanation of destruction, translated abbauen as deconstruction. So it came to take on a life of its own, and Derrida is often thought of as the father of deconstruction. But again, it's like to some degree feels like he's living and writing in the shadow or in the ghost of Grandpa Heidegger, and the Nazi, and Derrida's Jewish. So Derrida's born in 1930 in Algeria. His dad's like a traveling salesman. There's an interview where who is it? Avital Ronell, one of his many interesting students, talks about having dinner with Derrida's mother and asking her, has there ever been anyone in the family who was anything like Jacques Derrida? Like, were there other very smart, very verbal talents, any great readers, any creative? And she said, no, nowhere. No, it's it's completely wild. And they were trying to explain they were trying to brag about her son to her, and they said he's got his own word in the dictionary. And um, the word was, and the spell checker's trying to make me change it. Difference. So difference with an A instead of an E. And Richard Rorty suggested this was in fact a typo, that Derrida misspelled the word. And in French, you can't hear the difference between difference with an A and difference with an E. So it's a difference that is only visible, not audible. So it's part of Derrida's deconstruction of phonocentrism. Phonocentrism is the idea that basically written language is secondary to oral language, that the truth, the immediacy and truth of philosophy, this is in Socrates, for example, is best conveyed in a living dialogue between people rather than a written text. A written text is a kind of memory aid, but it risks all these distortions. And Derrida reverses that. And not to argue that writing is more essential than speech, but as part of a strategy of deconstruction. So one of the strategic moments of any deconstruction is a kind of reversal where you take the term that the dominant term has gained its dominance by permanently subordinating, and you flip them and you make an argument for the, in fact, primordiality, originarity, greater importance of the subordinated term. Not because you're just trying to actually suggest that, writing is more immediate and truthful than speech, but because you're trying to undermine 2,700 years of a tradition in which speech was treated as secondary. So that's part of a deconstructive strategy. But the idea that there's a mechanism or a method or an algorithm that you could come up with where you could teach, a generative AI, for example, to deconstruct a text is something Derrida always resisted. And hence the reason why my friends desire to download Derrida into a neural net, I think is it's misguided insofar as computers are algorithmic machines. Now, LLMs aren't exactly algorithmic machines, so maybe that critique meets its limits there. But, we could talk more about that. Um, Long versus parole. Yeah, that's so. Saussure is the other really huge influence on Derrida. So Ferdinand Saussure is a very famous French linguist, and he's kind of been completely overshadowed by, the rise of Chomsky and then the post-Chomskyan developments in linguistics. But Saussure's central idea that Derrida takes over, I'll give you Derrida's version of it. I'm no expert on Saussure, is that language functions in a way that's very different from what philosophy's imagined, again, since Plato. So in the philosophical tradition, we tend to think that like the word ball, there's a soccer ball in the background of my screen here. So the word ball gets its meaning by its correspondence to the ball outside language. So there's sense and reference, and the sense is like the meaningfulness of the word bald, what the senses it has, the meanings it takes on. But those senses are somehow grounded in their relation to this external referent, this referent to an object that's outside subjectivity. Now, Heidegger had already, in Being and Time, his first and most famous book, deconstructed subject-object dualism, which is Descartes' fundamental contribution to Western philosophy is the split between subjectivity and objectivity. His proof that the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm thinking. I can doubt that I have this body. I can doubt that I'm awake, but I can't doubt that I'm thinking because doubting is a form of thinking. So I get this incontrovertible certainty about my own thinking, and that becomes the axiomatic foundation of all thought. And then the world is outside of me, and I have to get outside my subjectivity, the external world, have a representation of the ball, bring it back into my subjectivity. So Saussure's move was to say, and Derrida's probably his most famous line is, "There's nothing outside language." So there's no external perspective from, or not, sorry, nothing outside the text is the way he put it. In other words, that because he doesn't want, this is again Heidegger. Heidegger talks about Rede, and that often gets translated as discourse. But for Heidegger, Rede is like the way we articulate intelligibility. So the way you sit in a chair, the way you talk, the way you walk, your body language, the way you eat, that's all Reda. So, and it's embodied well before it becomes explicitly articulated. Similarly, Derrida thinks of texts as a group without a contrast class. Like everything's a text. So there's no way to get outside. If I say like, well, I can get outside um, all my interpretations to see whether that's a ball over there. I can just walk over there and squeeze it. It's the Hume's famous refutation of skepticism. I can just squeeze the ball, and I see that it's really there. The Derridian move is to say, how does that act of squeezing a ball make sense to you? It's a text that you're reading. So there's no way to get outside all interpretation in order to see whether the interpretation is actually true. And this thought basically that hi Dave, this thought that that there's words don't get their meaning by corresponding to a reality outside language. That's the Saussurean move that Derrida takes on. So difference, the ball, gets its meaning from everything it's not. Chair, floor, table. Uh, the ball is something like the totality of differences from the ball. So instead of ontology, which is the study of what is, entities and their being, what it means to be an entity. So what makes a ball a ball? How's a ball different from a square? That kind of thing. That would be the ontology of balls. Um, Derrida's move is hauntology. And hauntology is that there's not really any things. Like our perception of things is a kind of ghostly misapprehension of what is really a world of endlessly diffracted difference. That is, I think I'm seeing a ball over there, but what I'm really experiencing is like a product of everything a ball isn't. And I myself, in order to have an experience of a ball, so difference is both all the things that are different from balls and the differing and deferring. That's the Husserlian moment in Derrida. So, like, to relate to the ball, I have to be able to anticipate it as something coming toward me and then remember it as something that's gone by. So, in fact, there's no present, like the present itself as some permanent, pure moment untouched by past and future doesn't exist. This is another being in time move in Heidegger's being in time. That what we take to be the present is actually constitutively contaminated by what has been and what's coming to be. So I can't relate to a ball without having this past sense that informs it and projecting myself forward into a world in which that ball will endure or not. This is another one of my favorite Derridian terms. Inevitability. Derrida had a genius for polysyllabic neologisms. So those of us who always liked learning new words, it's like the new word lets you see something, some new concept. Neologism is one of the DSM's diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, but it's also what philosophers do. So Aristotle famously coined a lot of terms. Um, so inevitability is the thought that I can't see a ball just once. To encounter a ball, I have to have already seen balls. I'm iterating. Iterating is like repeating, having a second. And iteration's inevitable. There can't be a first and there can't be a last. Derrida, he radicalizes Heideggerian deconstruction. For Heidegger, deconstruction is like an artichoke. You're peeling away the layers to get back to the heart, the original experience that determined or shaped everything that came after. For Derrida, deconstruction is more like an onion. You peel away the layers and it dissolves into nothingness. It's genealogy rather than archaeology. You can't trace your ancestors back to Adam and Eve or whatever. At some point, it disappears into the mists of time. So there's no first and there's no last. There's no first. Derrida made fun of like the search for the origin as the quest for a virgin grandmother. He was also very funny, as you. Dave, were you going to ask me a question, or are you just sharing your visage?
I just thought I would turn the camera on and yeah, because I was losing Wi-Fi where I was at, and so I was like, I want to post up somewhere, and I thought I'd raise a question since you called on me though. And
Please.
basically on Saussure, with his semiotic system and the way that it's based in difference, one of the interesting things about Saussure is that he brackets out the psychological and the physical. Explicitly, he does this in the course on general linguistics. And obviously, Heidegger's not thinking in terms of physical and psychological. This is that dualism he's trying to circumnavigate, but or deconstruct. But nevertheless, one of the ways that he does bypass that and potentially go beyond Saussure, at least how I've tended to think about it, is with the equipmental totality and the idea that things have meaning in reference to things insofar as that's useful. And so it's a very pragmatic sense. And that's obviously not the fundamental sense of meaning in our world, but it's his starting point in being in time. And so it's in order to, for the sake of which, that whole section. And I'm just curious if Derrida ever does anything with that, or does he just go hard into the Saussure?
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. So I would say it's very fundamental to Derrida, but in a hidden way, in the sense that Derrida says deconstruction happens in titles and footnotes, meaning like the Husserlian attempt to bracket off the natural attitude, the fantasy from Derrida's perspective that you could like put out of play all your assumptions about there being a world and all your kind of what philosophers call folk psychological beliefs. You could somehow ignore them and just pay attention to how you're experiencing things solely within the domain of consciousness. That's the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, epoche, epoch. Epoche as Derrida used to say, in Greek means putting in parentheses. And if you pay attention to the parentheses in a Derridian text, a text that I shouldn't Derridian in the one true sense, it's like Christian. Nietzsche says the last Christian died on the cross. The last Derridian died of pancreatic cancer in 2003. There's no real Derridians. It's like, how do you can't, there's no new Leo Messi. There might be some new genius, but there's not a new version of that genius. Anyway, if you look at his parentheticals, he'll even in his late work say things like, in his lectures, he'd say things like, here I want to open a parenthesis. I would open a parenthesis, and then he would go on for 20 minutes and then say, like, here I close the parenthesis. So it's a kind of like footnote in the middle of the talk in which a ton of interesting stuff is happening. So it's even like a refusal to repress the text into the footnote. If you think about someone like me who loves footnotes, a footnote is a kind of semi-repress. It's like I'm repressing this, but I'm not going to repress my repression of it. It breaks up the flow of the text, but it's important. And if people are going to object to what I say, I want this there. So those who are really deeply interested in this point I'm making here can go see the deeper discussion of it that your average reader might not actually care very much about. For Derrida, even that move kind of became suspect in the end, and he started really believing that you should own your repressions. You should put your parentheticals in the text. What's the in his very last book, The Beast and the Sovereign, what's his last lectures? And probably my favorite. I've been teaching it. I teach a grad seminar on Derrida probably every 3 semesters or so. And I always end it with his final seminars on, it's called The Beast and the Sovereign 2. And he gave it while he was dying from pancreatic cancer, which is a cancer that also killed Richard Rorty. And Richard Rorty's daughter joked darkly that it's a cancer you get from reading too much Heidegger, which I think is a horrible joke. I hope that's not true. So the in The Beast and the Sovereign, he knows he's demising, but his students don't know. So he gives this lecture where he reads exactly where he reads Robinson Crusoe and Heidegger's fundamental concepts of metaphysics in the margins of each other. Like he's reading William Defoe in the margins of Heidegger and Heidegger in the margins of Defoe. And what's interesting about that is that in Aporias, Derrida's sustained critique of being in time's analysis of death, which I can talk about, I've written about a lot. Um, Derrida conflates death and demise. That is, he confuses existential death or Dasein's actually being at the end of its world with demise. That is our experience of croaking or kicking the bucket, as most readers do. Most readers conflate those two. They are connected, but they're different in Heidegger. And in the last book, he starts to articulate a sense of a kind of existential death and an existential afterlife, like a kind of way in which um, I can live on after I croak. So a vision of, he calls it survivance, like it's hard to translate, but survival or something, surviving, where the what I am, because what I am is a constantly changing, holistically interconnected system of differences. Right? I think I'm Ian, but that's like thinking that's a ball. You know, what I am is all the stuff I'm not, and everything I'm not is constantly, every thought I have changes that. So every person I bump into, every gesture of your face, the background of everything's like this, it's this endlessly constellated, fragmented, fractalated sense of self, and that lives on. This is another sense of hauntology. All of that lives on in innumerable ways. So let me give you another great Derridian concept, destinarency. So destinarency is instead of destiny or errancy, two Heideggerian concepts, Derrida puts them together and subverts what they mean in Heidegger into his own thought. So destinarency is that the letter is always destined to go awry. He writes a book called Postcards. It's fascinating, and it's about how the postcard never arrives at its destination, and yet it always arrives at its destination. Like you can't control how other people take the meaning of what you say. You know, you can give the exact same talk to 10 people and they'll take it 10 different ways. And that's out of your control. And that's a good thing because if your goal is for the system of differences that you are to survive, if you want to survive in some form, then the way that happens is not by trying to predetermine the shape of your survival. Like if you could say, here, I'm Derrida, these are my three main points. As long as you understand these 3 points, you've understood Derrida, then Derrida's dead. He's been left in the past. You can take those 3 points, move on, leave him in the past. It's the fact that his texts are these endlessly rich, fascinating, provocative works that beg to be developed in creative, new, different ways by each of us that gives him an afterlife. And he suggests that that afterlife, that every time you read him, it's like you're resuscitating him. Your reading of him is a breath of life that brings him back to life in a life that's not less alive than he was when he was alive. There was a moment in his seminar in Irvine when he was talking about what the self is, you know, that what the self is from the perspective of deconstruction. Once we deconstruct mind, body, nouns, properties, identities, and we're left with difference. What survives? And he had a thought of like auto affection. That was his view in the 90s. It's kind of feeling yourself. Feeling yourself is what you can't get rid of. And he's like, but the self-feeling that I am beneath the undeconstructible self-feeling that I am, how's that different from a bird feeling itself as it flies across the sky? And he looked out the window as a bird flew by, and Irvine said, I'd like to believe that, you know, even after I'm gone, everywhere a bird goes, there I am. So he did have this thought, he was tormented by demise, by croaking, and felt like his whole life was an attempt to come to terms with what it meant that we have to die, and how if he failed to do that, he would have failed as a philosopher. And in his last, I think it was his last, it's called his last interview. I don't know if it really was his last interview, but the interviewer quotes that and says, because that was a famous interview he gave to the New Yorker in the 80s, the big picture of himself and sort of it's the height of your fame. You know you're about to go into the be forgotten when the New Yorker starts. It's like the New Yorker covers the indie band. The indie band's not an indie band anymore. And they say the interviewer in the last interview says, so how, you said in this interview, if you don't find a way to make peace with death and dying, you'll have failed as a philosopher. So you're now it's out, you're dying. You've got this cancer, stage 4. Have you made peace with death and demise? And he says, no, like I've never been further away from being able to make peace with it. And a lot of people, a lot of philosophers have taken that as a confession that he failed as a philosopher. And Derrida had a million enemies. I think analytic philosophy was kind of defined as anti-Derrida. It's like when Derrida died, analytic philosophy died too, because it lost the common enemy that like gave it its identity, the other that it could be the same by just being not that. And as a person in analytic philosophy departments studying Derrida, and usually the only one, Derrida both appreciated having a philosopher in his class because he saw himself as a philosopher. But I was the only philosopher, like the only grad student in philosophy in his seminar at Irvine you know, out of the 30 people enrolled in the class, and there were 500 people sitting in on the public lecture. But what he meant by that wasn't that he failed as a philosopher, but that you're the only one who will know whether you made like making peace with death and dying. Yeah, maybe you could do it ahead of time, but that wasn't his view. His view is that's going to come down to the moment, whatever the hell it's like, that last moment of life, which he sometimes described as that final breath. The final breath for him was like the splitting of the witness structure into witnessing and bearing witness. Here's another Derridian thought. So the experience itself, this is in Plato. You apply the idea of a tree to the tree to see a tree. It's in Kant. You take the sense data from intuition and you categorize it with concepts in order to have a world. There's all this um, subconscious work that your mind is doing in order to organize what you experience as an intelligible world. So Derrida sometimes presented that as the witness structure. And again, this is Heideggerian. In Being and Time, phenomenology is phenomenological witnessing, Bezeugung, attestation. You're describing your experiences and seeing if other people experience them that way. And do you experience guilt like this? Do you experience death like this? And in the case of demise, so say, let me take a normal experience that you see like a car hit a bicycle, and imagine you have to like testify to the police or to the somebody about it. There's you seeing it, that's you witnessing it, and then them saying, so did the bicycle run the red light, or did the car run the red light, or did they just not see it? That's you bearing witness to what happened. So all experience is a kind of witnessing and then bearing witness, like undergoing and then spontaneously making sense of. And he sometimes suggested that demise was the splitting of that structure, where you might be able to bear witness to the very last moment of being alive, of your being alive, but you wouldn't be able to, sorry, you might be able to witness it, but you would not be able to subsequently bear witness to it. As far as we can tell from this side of the mortal veil, we don't receive information from the other side via very reputable sources. You'd have to do as I say in my death book, you'd have to do your phenomenology by Ouija board to figure out what happens next. I was going to ask you about his enemies. Yeah, which ones? God, they danced on his grave because it was like if you watch the Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, um, which I taught in philosophy of literature and stuff. The second half of it, when Hamilton's become disgraced, but he's still a force because nobody wants to go against Hamilton because he's such an amazing writer, and he'll just rip you a new one, and you'll lose the debate publicly and be humiliated. So, Jefferson doesn't want to go against him, although he hates him and all this stuff. That was Derrida. So as long as Derrida was alive, these people, they would try and take him out. John Searle, the very famously sharp, pugnacious, pugilistic philosopher, one of my teachers at Berkeley, but he was like a John Wayne cowboy who just was raring for a fight at all times. Picked a fight with Derrida, and it's not Derrida's best work, but Searle doesn't come out of that one unscathed. It's hard to make sense of what's going on there, but it's people didn't call Derrida into account because they would lose. And he was such an amazing respondent. And after he died, there was just nobody, like Derrida would be constantly responding to whatever was happening in the news. If he was alive now, he'd be, giving us his interpretations of Iran and the US and you name it, right? And there are people still trying to do that, but they're not doing it, in my opinion, with the depth and insight of Derrida. It's part of the reason Zizek has gotten so famous is he's sort of like the next best thing we've had since Derrida. He's the closest we've had to that kind of like incredible, prolific genius that's also theoretically deep and profound, but also funny and capable of speaking to current events. Yeah, I think we live in a funny
Uh,
time where Derrida's kind of forgotten right now, much like John Rawls, or if you think of like the dominance of John Rawls while he was alive, he was completely dominated political philosophy, and I almost never hear his name now. So we're living in like the post-Rawls era. That won't last forever. People will rediscover Rawls. They'll rediscover Derrida, I think.
I wanted to do a quick interjection, maybe to get you to talk a little bit more about um, maybe on this the reception after his death,
Yeah,
or towards the end of his life. Sokal would be a part of towards the end of his life, Searle during, but Peterson, Jordan Peterson, and then Gabriel Rockhill as a sort of orthodox Marxist, Stalinist kind of public intellectual. So left and right both attacking him, but they're probably the only people I know of who really attack or blame him for postmodernism and critical theory today.
I see.
Um, but that maybe if you want to say something to that, but then I have
Yeah.
a question about a different set of enemies. Yeah.
Yeah, for me it was more Brian Leiter and Maine's like the Brian Leiter is the guy who does like the philosophy department rankings, and he was so happy when Derrida died and wrote the stuff about what a charlatan he was and how his influence has been nothing but bad on the humanities and all. So, and there's been a lot of like, people. Derrida became so famous that just like Derrida had to do to Sartre, people felt like they had to do to Derrida. They had to like critique him, take him out to make some room for themselves to do something of their own, and that's understandable. But yeah, Peterson's thing is that's like postmodern neo-Marxism is the enemy, right? And Derrida's no Marxist. That's like he grew up in the Marxist age. He's buddies with Althusser. He's the only one who stayed friends with Althusser after Althusser killed his wife. He's visiting Althusser in the hospital, the mental hospital, and while no one else is. So they were like they were the two, what do they call them? There's a French term for like tutors. They were the ones, their main job was to train the super smart French kids to take the exam to get into the elite French schools. And so, part of the genius of Derrida is that his day job for 30 years is teaching all the classic texts. He's teaching these kids like you don't know what the exam's going to be on. It could be on Condorcet, it could be on Malebranche. It's not necessarily going to be on Marx, almost never. It's probably going to, and it might not even be on Descartes. It's going to be on Leibniz's theory of blah blah blah. So you got to know the whole history, and then you got to know what the basic views about what that philosopher contributed are, so that you can show that you know and have absorbed the tradition. We don't do that much anymore, but that was a standard aspect of a lot of programs was a qualifying exam that would be a kind of comprehensive examination where you showed a mastery of the tradition. So Derrida taught that. And his way of reading the tradition was never the standard way, but he had the standard way under his belt. So it's not like he's making this stuff up in ignorance of what the mainstream views are. Rather, he's mastered the mainstream views and he's going beyond them. That's why I always noticed like everyone hated Derrida in my world, not but to some degree. There was very few Derrida lovers in the philosophy world. And but when they would find out I loved him and they would, if we were alone and drinking a beer or something, they'd be nice and say, well, there is that one text of Derrida's I really like. And I'd be, oh, really? Which one? And the crazy thing was, this always struck me, that the text they would say that was the one text of Derrida's they liked was always the text Derrida had written on their subject of specialty. their specialization. So like if they were a Shakespeare scholar, they would really like Derrida's thing on Shakespeare. Or if they worked on James Joyce, they'd really like his thing on Joyce. Or if they worked on Descartes, they'd like his thing on Descartes. If they worked on Heidegger, they'd like his thing on Heidegger. The other stuff they wouldn't like. They didn't understand it. But the stuff on there's an exception to this, which is the Nietzscheans, the analytic Nietzscheans. But for the most part, this is true. And that's the opposite of how philosophers normally are. Philosophers normally are like, oh, I like his stuff on Marx that I don't work on, but his stuff on Heidegger is not that good. Let me tell you, it's like a way of protecting your turf. Like they're not as good in my area of specialty, but they're fine on the stuff that I don't care about. This was the opposite, which showed, I think, that you had to have a deep knowledge of Joyce or Shakespeare or whatever it was in order to pick up what Derrida was putting down. You know, like he was going through the text at a level of detail that he didn't explain. It wasn't like Shakespeare for dummies. It was Shakespeare for PhD professors with 20 years of teaching Shakespeare under their belts. So that's what made it kind of amazing. And yeah, there's lots of things you can criticize about it, including kind of what now I think as I reread it feels, self-indulgent and even a little narcissistic. But it's also like just love of language. This Heideggerian thought that we don't speak language, language speaks us. And in his late in the Beast and the Sovereign 2, he talks about rehabilitating, deconstructing and rehabilitating a form of courage that would be outside philogocentrism that he later generalized to onto-theo-carno-philogocentrism. I think that was his longest neologism. So philogocentrism is the way the entire Western tradition has been logocentric, centered around reason at the exclusion of emotion, right? If you look even back at Pythagoras, Pythagoras divides everything into like odd, even, female, male, emotional, rational, and pairs them together. And this entire tradition goes along with like humans superior to animals, onto-theology as an attempt to have a final story about what all reality means. So Derrida saw, he wasn't just, critiquing every little thing that came down the pipe. He was suggesting that Western philosophy is profoundly marked by an ambition that it can never live up to, a fantasy about death, basically, a fantasy about being done. We could master and control all reality with our minds, get a final picture of what everything is, and then we wouldn't have to learn anything anymore. This is Baudrillard talks about this with regard to the AIs. It's like we just create we put all our food and thoughts and everything on the internet. It enters into a state of pure circulation, get a singularity where it becomes self-conscious, give birth to Skynet. It wipes us out. This is in The Matrix when Keanu, when he's still Mr. Anderson, he gives the computer tech paraphernalia to the people and then he follows the rabbit tattoo on her shoulder. The book he opens up that's hiding, it's a book safe, is cut away to the last chapter, which is on nihilism, which is Baudrillard's another post-Heideggerian, but like a post-Heideggerian with no hope. So yeah, the postmodern neo-Marxism, Derrida's not a postmodernist and he's not a Marxist. So if Jordan Peterson thinks he is, he's confused. Heidegger's a postmodernist and a structuralist. Derrida is not a postmodernist and he's a post-structuralist. So Derrida doesn't believe there's some fixed structure that can explain things. Heidegger does. Onto-theology, for example. That's the history, like all the attempts from Plato through Nietzsche to completely master and control the world in a single conceptual system, all share this structure, the skeletal structure of onto-theology, of trying to get to the innermost core and the outermost perspective and then link those two foundations together. That's an onto-theology. Derrida thought that was an overgeneralization that missed the specificity. He also didn't believe in epochs. So for Heidegger, the history of the West unfolds as relatively coherent and discrete historical ages. You have like the ancient and the medieval and the modern. And what makes them able to cohere and endure is these onto-theologies that form their deepest ground and core. And Rorty thought basically all humans have always been the same. If you could go back to ancient Greece and speak Greek, they'd be just like you. Derrida thought the opposite. Like things are constant. You can't step in the same river twice. I'm not even the same me from the beginning to the end of this sentence. I'm this ever-changing system of differences. So there's no such thing as an epoch. That's a fantasy of a kind of stability. I don't even have the stability of knowing that I'm the same guy I was yesterday. This is Derrida's debates with Gadamer about hermeneutics, where about Gadamer's thought was that the ideal form of hermeneutics or interpretation is one where it's Gespräch, conversation, dialogue, where you and I talk and neither of us it's not like you're waiting to talk and I'm waiting to talk and we just put our ideas out there. It's a kind of synergy where these two bubbles that we are join and fuse into a larger whole, and something happens in the conversation that neither of us brought ahead of time, out of which that's the fusion of horizons. Out of that fusion of horizons, we feel understood. Like I feel like you get me and I get you. And that was the hermeneutic ideal in Gadamer, and Derrida was just profoundly skeptical. He's like, I don't even ever feel like I understand myself. I don't ever feel like anyone's ever understood me. This description Gadamer has of being understood in a conversation is completely foreign to me. And Gadamer, to his credit, one of Heidegger's most famous students, learned a lot from Derrida and said, yeah, I overemphasized understanding. I should have, left more room for difference, for recognizing that sometimes what you understand is that you don't understand the other person. And that's important too, not thinking you understand them when you don't. So yeah, I don't know. I think Peterson's he's the result of right-wing affirmative action as far as I can tell. He's got a couple good ideas, and it's good that he's getting people thinking about philosophy, but he's not himself a philosopher. Anytime somebody uses huge labels like postmodern neo-Marxism to try and dismiss everything that isn't them, that's philosophy with a nuclear bomb, not even philosophy with a hammer, as Nietzsche said, just trying to nuke the whole horizon to make room for yourself as the sole legitimate alternative.
Quick little commercial break here to share that members at Theory Underground really drive everything. This is ultimately my project for the development of my theory, but it is also something that helps other people in the development of their own theory. And if it wasn't for other people who are finding that useful, well, I don't know that I would be here today. And so I want to say thank you to the membership here at Theory Underground. You guys make all of this possible. If you are interested in becoming a member at Theory Underground, that's how you would access the ongoing and past courses and seminars at TU, as well as office hours, the lecture boot camp, as well as the Reclaim Writing workshop or the Projectus cohort, which are all things available to people depending on the tier that you become a member at. Okay, and so yeah, it can be a lot of fun, and it's also a great way to take what would otherwise just be a hobby and instead turn it into a serious undertaking. All right, and that's how you're gonna meet a lot of cool people, learn a lot of really cool things. And so if you want to get involved, theoryunderground.com/subscribe is the best way to do it. Hope to see you soon.
So then the follow-up on that is just a little bit more about the the major forces of his time, so Marxism, especially Maoism, we're talking about like May 68, but also, Kojève. These are kind of what come to mind for me as like, I understand like if he's in the context where Badiou is canceling Deleuze lectures because Deleuze is a metaphysician, and that's problematic from the Maoist position. It's like, this is you can't really say that kind of period of French academia.
Yeah.
And so Derrida comes out with all of these concepts. And so I'm curious about the ways that these concepts cut across through or intervene in the
Nice. Yeah.
the midst of all that. Yeah.
Derrida's kind of the original French philosopher in America. I mean, you could say Baudrillard, because Baudrillard's book, America, came out. It was serialized in Rolling Stone. And that was like the Tocqueville comes to America and writes, it's like the alienated Frenchman in America writes the critique of America. And that was Baudrillard. So we had this kind of hunger for the French view. It was radical. Who are these people? They're coming way out of left field. And Derrida got famous in America. And then his fame in America kind of reflected into France. So he was, it was only at the very end of his life that he was at a famous institution. He never like he finished his defending his academic pedigrees very late in life. He always had this kind of ambivalent relationship to French. I mean, he was a brilliant French speaker and reader, but when he was a kid in Algeria, French was the colonizing language. And he grew up in a family where he got kicked out of school for a year. They told him no Jewish kids are allowed to go to school. So he spent a year like helping his dad sell, well, I forget what they were selling, and traveling around with his dad on the back of a truck and playing soccer. And so and yet then rose to the sort of highest heights of the French intellectual scene, but always as he was always the outsider. There's my favorite early picture of him. My favorite early picture of him is like him, and everyone's wearing like their three-piece suits, all French and stylish, and he's wearing it's not Converse high tops, but he's wearing high tops, like black high tops, and this is like 1950. So he's still kind of flaunting a little of his own style amidst even this very fancy thing. None of those pictures have his pipe. He always had his pipe in his mouth when I was talking to him. Sad Derrida. Why is he all sad?
I,
The
I
idea that
asked, I
philosophers,
asked,
yeah,
I asked AI I said, show me Derrida sad because nobody understands him.
I don't think
And
he's
so,
sad. Yeah, no, he's happy.
no,
It's
yeah,
because you don't understand me that I have a future. Like if I could be understood, then you could get me right and then move on. You'd be done. It's that I
exactly.
I don't even understand me. So how could you ever be done understanding me? As long as you're drawn into trying, then you're going to have to read me. Somebody raised the question about wanting to know how to um, read Derrida. I want to hear more about that. Yeah, there's the old line that's attributed to Marx and Jesus and all these people, like give a person a fish they eat for a day, teach them how to fish they eat for a life. In my classes, I try and teach people how to read, so we're doing close reading, and I'm happy to close read a couple passages with y'all if you want. That would probably be
That
what
would
we
be
would need to
good.
do. Yeah.
Matthew, are you handy? Are you ready to hand?
Make myself ready to hand.
Are you present at hand?
That would be exactly what I would hope for. I really appreciate that if you'd be able to do it. One of the best books I read on Derrida was Derrida and Wittgenstein by Henry Stanton. It was like the first book where I felt like I was starting to understand Derrida and
Interesting.
one of his books. And I was
Yeah.
like, I think I can start to see the through line, but I feel like the biggest obstacle to Derrida is just reading his text. And so, like a demonstration of
What did you take to be the through line? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but I'm curious because yeah, that's a hard question for me.
I would say that I was just grasping at the thinnest little filament, so I can't really speak to anything that would enlighten you.
Yeah. For me, I think the skeleton key's been Heidegger, like seeing him as a profoundly critical and yet profoundly sympathetic reader of Heidegger, someone who thinks, like Levinas, that we have to go through Heidegger to come out the other side. There's no going around it and all the fantasies that we could somehow leave it outside our analysis and let that old Nazi die in obscurity. That's like people try to do that with Freud. Like, oh, Freud's a charlatan, and then they think their dreams are significant and their slips are significant. And right, it's like if you don't understand how profoundly Heidegger shaped the entire generation of theorists that shaped everything that's happening today, the thought that you could just leave him behind is basically just like leaving your own self ununderstood. But on the Dave picture, the philosophers never understand themselves. That's Nietzsche. Nietzsche says the philosopher never understands themselves, and Heidegger quotes that sympathetically. So the thought, it's like other people might understand themselves because they're simple, but a philosopher can never understand themselves. They're not even the same person from day to day to begin to understand themselves. We philosophers are furthest from ourselves of all people. That's Nietzsche. And you might think that's just a kind of hyperbolic polemic or something, but I think Derrida believed it. You might think in Heidegger's case, it's motivated by a desire to not look too closely, which there's some truth to that. But I think, Derrida looked at himself pretty closely. If you want to read a text, give me a thought. I mean, one of the ones I love teaching is this crazy one because it's the one all the analytic Nietzscheans hate. Uh, and I love. So Spurs, Nietzsche's styles. It's sort of the one of the great middle Derrida works. There's the early Derrida, who I'm not so crazy about, but a lot of previous, that was him writing these massive books like of grammatology. The first book of Derrida's that I struggled with was Of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question, which was his public response to Heidegger's Nazism when the scandal re-erupted in the 90s from Victor Farias's book. The French Heideggerians felt they finally had to respond publicly. I mean, Derrida had been responding carefully, subtly for a long time, but respond in a whole book. And I was trying to read that as an undergraduate, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever read. And I'd been reading philosophy for several years, and that's part of what I fell in love with was like, okay, so if you're a philosopher and why would anyone be a philosopher? First of all, part of it you have to like, it's like going for the heavy weights in the intellectual gymnasium, trying to find the stuff that isn't easy, but that is important. And in that world, Derrida was the most difficult, I thought, more difficult than Hegel, much more difficult than Heidegger. And yet, Of Spirit makes the case basically that I still think is right, that Heidegger's relationship to Nazism is one where, I'll come back to Spurs, but is one where Heidegger's general strategy is to take the buzzwords of the day, Kampf, Mein Kampf, right? Kampf, and say, instead of understanding that as like Hitler's struggle in his jail cell to redeem Germany from its humiliation in the hands of the French, it's really the polemos, that Heraclitus says is the father of all, the tension of opposites that structures the field of intelligibility and the struggle of human beings against being in order to carve out an intelligible world. That's so Heidegger takes the central buzzwords, Kampf, Gemeinschaft, um, Führen, Introduction to Metaphysics, 35, Einführen, that's introduction. That's leader, the Führer, the leader. So and there Heidegger says, the leadership is being led by the matter that's most important. And the true leader must leave the followers their authentic resistance and all this stuff. So it's never a simple, let's go murder the Jews. I mean, Heidegger is constantly from the beginning to the end saying the mainstream understanding of Nazism as a kind of what he calls biologism, that is an ontological reduction of human beings to a biological picture, that we could somehow be reduced to this eugenic understanding, and the goal of a political state being to purify and maximize the strength of the gene pool in some biologically confused way. But even if it wasn't biologically confused, which it was, the thought that somehow humans could be reduced to their biology is a reductive ontological move. So Heidegger's consistently criticizing all that and then taking the terms and using them to try and lead the people he's talking to back to his own thinking, his own philosophy. That's why, like when he gave the rectoral address, the Nazi Party member was there, said, "Well, it's great that this famous philosopher wants to be a Nazi, but he's got his own private National Socialism. Has nothing to do with what we're talking about." This guy's got his own. As Karl Jaspers said in 34, when Heidegger, while he was the Führer of Freiburg, came and gave his lectures there, he said Heidegger wants to be the Führer of the Führer. He wants to be the leader of the leader. That is the Grand Vizier. He wanted to be the one. He was like the Steve Bannon to Trump. He wanted to be the one who would explain to the empty, pompous, you know, windbag what it would actually mean to make America great again. And you might not agree with Bannon or Heidegger, but it's a mistake to think they're simply an empty, windbag with no ideas. It's an insult to Heidegger to compare him that closely to Bannon, but I think structurally it's a similar move. But as Derrida says in Of Spirit, you can never make this kind of move without being contaminated by the very conceptual system you're seeking to transform. So you can stay outside and throw rocks and try and change the system from outside, but that rarely works. Or you can try and go inside and change it by transforming the meaning of the central concepts from within. But the danger of doing that is you get transformed by the mainstream understanding as well. So there's no, and Derrida didn't really believe in the outside. His book on Marx, by the way, is worth reading. I think it's one of the last things he wrote. So on Spurs, so this is basically Nietzsche, Derrida pushing back against Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche. So in 1936 to 1940, that is sort of Heidegger was the rector of Freiburg from 33 to 34, and he stepped down after a year because they wouldn't let him do anything. They wouldn't let him put his vision into effect. He said, like, both the higher ups in the party and the students wanted like a more enthusiastic embrace of the movement. I was trying to lead it into what he called to his student Blockmann a second and more profound awakening, in which it would discover what he infamously called its inner truth and greatness, i.e., its connection to the Greeks and its Heideggerianism. So he was trying to turn Nazism into something very different than what we all forever will think of as Nazism. So just simply, smearing him with the Nazi brush, while true, is, a hopelessly blunt instrument that fails to understand him. So Derrida's looking at these texts that famously Heidegger gives from 36 to 40 on Nietzsche, their lectures, and they're really the first one, 36 to 37, is Heidegger arguing against the biologistic interpretations of Nietzsche that reduce Nietzsche to biology. That's Baumler and Krieg, these Nazi functionaries who were also leaders of their universities. It's it's Goebbels. These guys who are reading The Will to Power, which had been published in German in 1906 and then again in 1909 in the full edition as his masterwork, his Hauptwerk, his complete edition. That's got Nietzsche's vision for the deliberate genetic manipulation of human beings that would reshape humans the way artists sculpt clay in order to create the masters of the earth. And it's the master race, Nietzsche calls it. So that was Heidegger's arguing that has to be understood not in terms of biology, but that biology has to be understood in terms of will to power. And that Nietzsche, as a metaphysical thinker, is trying to transform what we mean by being. He's not a biologistic thinker who's trying to get us to think biologically. That's the first. So he's using Nietzsche, who's the most influential philosopher in the political movement of the Nazis, to try and transform what Nietzsche means, and hence what Nazism means. And when that's failing, as it obviously is, he then starts criticizing Nietzsche the following year, and increasingly sharply. And that's his critique of Nazism. So he's critiquing Nazism by critiquing the Nietzscheanism that had become one of the main influences on mainstream Nazism. So when, these are fascinating lectures. When they got published, in 61, I think, in French, Pierre Klossowski, the famous psychiatrist who was part of the movement Dave was evoking earlier, he translated Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures into French, and that kicked off what in America we call the new Nietzscheans, like Derrida, Deleuze, all these figures who were deeply in Foucault, figures who were deeply inspired, as Foucault said, not by Nietzsche on his own and not by Heidegger on his own, but by Heidegger's Nietzsche. That was the really dramatic catalyst for our thinking. And Derrida's struggling with that in Spurs, and in a super creative way, and in a way that I think is really relevant to trans philosophy, 40 years ago. He's using this hermaphroditic figure as one of the central thoughts. The spur is a kind of penis vagina. It's like a hermaphroditic figure of male femality or female maleness. And he basically ends up arguing that. So the book the penultimate part of the book is he looks at Nietzsche left an unpublished note. One of his unpublished notes is Nachlass, his unpublished works, which includes almost all of what we think of as the will to power. That was Nietzsche didn't publish that. He went crazy while trying to prepare that for publication. One of the notes says, "I have forgotten my umbrella," and Derrida basically uses that fragment, "I've forgotten my umbrella," as the skeleton key to unlock the true meaning of Nietzsche. This is a classic Derridian deconstruction because it sounds like a joke. It's a parody. What do you mean? Like, I've forgotten my umbrella is the true, like Nietzsche wrote, "I've forgotten my umbrella" on the bottom of a piece of paper. That's the true secret to interpreting Nietzsche? What do you mean? And it turns out to mean that his forgotten umbrella is both open and closed. That is, it's open to ever new readings and it's closed to any final reading. So Nietzsche, the body of Nietzsche's work is like the forgotten umbrella. It can never be completely captured in a singular reading. There'll never be a definitive explanation of what Nietzsche was about. But so it's closed to any final reading, but it's open to endless new readings that use it to inspire, different thoughts that haven't come into existence yet. And that way of reading "I've forgotten my umbrella" as the truth of Nietzsche is a joke, but it's serious. Like he means it. He means what he says as that reading. And it's a way of like contesting Heidegger's reading, which uses the unpublished works to argue that the secret truth of Nietzsche's philosophy is will to power eternally recurring. Analytic Nietzscheans and in the English language think will to power is not a very important concept for Nietzsche. It only appears, 20 times in his published works or whatever. Eternal return, he didn't really mean that. He was losing his marbles. For Heidegger, these are the twin pillars, metaphysical pillars of Nietzsche's philosophy. So it's Derrida saying, just like Heidegger's using unpublished work to say eternally recurring will to power is the secret truth of Nietzsche's thinking, the hidden organizing center of it all, the Onto-theology. I've forgotten my umbrella could be. So I can play Heidegger's game too, but do it in such a way as to give a reading that rejects the Heideggerian attempt to give the complete story of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is nothing but the thinker of enframing, the thinker of the technological understanding of being, who reduces the being of all entities to eternally recurring will to power. That is, to nothing but force striving against force in order to keep force itself in force. So for Heidegger, we're all Nietzscheans. That is, we wear these invisible goggles that like make us see the world as nothing but will to power eternally recurring. And when we do that, we turn everything into meaningless stuff to be put on standby for optimization, just to get the most for the least. And that's enframing. That's the technological world in which, we've reduced all qualities to quantities. We think the good life is the life with the most money, and the most beautiful building is the tallest one. It's the age of Trump, basically. So for, Heidegger's thing is the Marxist critique is a symptom. It's not wrong, it's right, but it's a symptom of the Nietzsche's transformation of ontology. And Derrida's basically suspicious of all grand accounts. In that sense, he's a postmodernist, we could say, in the loose Lyotardian sense of suspicion of all meta-narratives. The rejection of any final account that could settle all the other accounts. But he's not a postmodernist in the literal sense of someone who believes there can be an age after modernity. That's Heidegger. The other beginning it's the beginning beyond late modernity, beyond the age of technological enframing. That's the postmodern. So Heidegger's the original postmodernist. That is true, but it's not relativistic. The postmodernism often gets used as a synonym for relativism. It's just saying there's no one final truth. Now you will only think that the rejection of a final truth leads to relativism if you think those are the exclusive alternatives. But you can get rid of the final truth and still have better and worse um, understandings. They'll just be better and worse relative to different aims. We have to specify what aims we're trying to come up with. So it's not relativistic in the sense of anything goes and anything's equally good. And Yeah. But I think these people are reacting against like the deconstruction of gender that Derrida participated in, the fantasy that you could reduce gender to like male and female. And that deconstruction had, I don't know if it had historical effects in the unleashing of gender difference and plurality, or if it was just an early recognition of the emergence of kind of gender difference and plurality. I suspect it's a little of both. What book of Derrida's would you suggest people start with? I would suggest Points. There's a book of interviews called Points, and it's Derrida speaking off the cuff in interviews, and they're incredibly brilliant. It get maybe even before that, in the age of the screen, I would say go watch the Derrida movie. So the Derrida movie by Kirby Dick and Amy Zierling. They were putting that movie together in Irvine while I was there. So it's the Derrida I knew. And I used to use Kirby Dick's movie. Kirby Dick, what a name. And so it gets worse. Kirby Dick's he wrote he's a movie director and he directed like this film's not yet been rated, this critique of the rating system after the Derrida movie. But before the Derrida movie, he did I think that's him. Maybe I'm confusing him with the Super Size Me guy. Anyway, the before the Derrida movie, Kirby Dick directed a movie called Sick, The Life and Death of Bob Flanagan's Super Masochist. And in Sick is the story of this guy, Bob Flanagan, who was a LA artist and famous masochist. He would do performance art shows about his masochism. And he had cystic fibrosis. And cystic fibrosis is like a congenital disease that before Bob Flanagan, nobody had made it out of their teens, maybe. Like no one had made it into their 20s, or certainly not out of their 20s. So he was, at that point, he lived the longest with cystic fibrosis of any human ever had. And basically like your lungs filled with water, and it's very fluid, not water. And it's very painful. And so he's in pain his whole life. So his response to being in pain was to, as very Freudian, was to become a masochist in order to kind of take control of the pain. And so he would do this performance art show where, he would do various things. You've seen versions of this now if you've ever seen any kind of LA or Las Vegas show, like sticking nails up your nose and that kind of thing. And there's the movie. I went and saw it in grad school with a bunch of my grad school friends, and the most disturbing part of the movie was not. We're watching it on a big screen back in the days of giant screen movie theaters. They still had some, and we're watching it at this old movie theater in San Diego with like the 60-foot screen. It's like IMAX now. And he does a close-up where he hammers a nail through his penis into a board. And that was not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was his final death scene, which Kirby presents in the film. And why that's so disturbing is he won't die. Like he's lingering on the threshold of death for like days and weeks. And his nurses are like begging him to let go. They're like, we can see how much pain you're in. Why won't, it's okay. You can let go. But this is a guy who's like made it his life not to let pain beat him. So he's just like hanging out on the border between life and death, probably longer than any human ever has. And I would use it before they went and did Derrida as an example of a Derridian deconstruction. Derrida deconstructs the border between life and death. That's like our ultimate metaphysical dichotomy. Here's a guy who really challenges the idea that that's a dichotomy is two sets that share no intersection, not a continuum like sunrise and sunset, but a dichotomy, life and death. And Derrida basically deconstruction is give me a dichotomy and I'll deconstruct it. So when these guys, HVACs, I guess, Jesus. And yeah, and I would use that story. And then when Kirby went and directed this Derrida film, I felt vindicated by my sense that this was somehow relevant to Derrida because they went and did a movie on Derrida. So that movie is a great introduction to Derrida. It might it depends. If you're a good reader, go read Points first, and flip around and find an interview that you really like. Yeah, Dave.
Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about it. There's a specific work by him that is more theoretical and less of an analysis on something that gets into basically just breaking down binaries, and it's supposed to be somewhat meta in that sense, but I can't remember for the life of me what that is, and I was looking for it. I can't find
Mm.
it. I don't think it's Points. Um,
No, no, Points is maximally accessible
okay. What would be his densest, just straight theory
of grammatology,
breakdown?
but it's that's also back when a philosopher felt like they had to write being in time, being in nothingness, being an event of grammatology. That's like the attempt to write the 800-page magnum opus. And yeah, or Derridians will get mad at me for saying that I don't love that book. That's like the Bible for the old school Derridians, but that's because that's kind of what put him on the map. For me, if you read Margins of Philosophy, this begins with difference. So the first essay is different. Well, sorry, this timpan. You can skip that because it's not going to make any sense. But then you go to difference, and it explains it explains difference. So difference is the concept I was explaining before about how what makes a cat is not its reference to a cat outside language, but it's all the things a cat isn't: rat, bat, hat. You know. Um, and the differing and deferring temporal relations and what it means to think that way. And then there's an essay, there's a little critique of being in time. That one's really hard. Then there's the ends of man, which is really interesting. Violence and metaphysics, that's where he basically made Levinas famous. That's another great one. But a lot of these presuppose a lot of Heidegger and a lot of Nietzsche. So that's what's good about the interviews. It's the same reason that my colleagues loved the one thing that he'd written about this area they'd spent their life studying. That's because you need to know a lot to pick up on the subtle moves he's making. So that's why I think Points is so good because it's him presenting his thoughts in a way that's clear. If you watch the Derrida film, by the way, and you try and watch the deleted scenes. They might even be on YouTube. Because one of them is Amy asking him about his views on love. And she's like, "What do you think about love?" And she's speaking French, l'amour. And he goes, l'amour, death? Like he's ready to talk about death. And she's like, "No, l'amour, amour, love." And he's like, "Oh, no, I have nothing to say about death. I'm an empty head on death. I have nothing to say." And she's, "Oh, please, you've talked about death so much. Are you just going to talk about death and not talk about love?" And no, 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 I can't. He sits there and he's like thinking. He's like, "No, I can't do it. It's impossible." And then he gives this brilliant, okay. And he gives this like brilliant analysis of love. That should have been in the movie. It's one of the best. It's one of the best parts. But the movie kind of, Derrida's in a bunch of films. He was in this film with a French actress who he's told to play himself and just be himself, and she's told to pretend to be a student asking him questions, and there's no script, she's just asking him questions, and she dies like in real life. And so for him, cinema then becomes like the theater of ghosts, and he starts writing about film in a way that's this hauntology and how photographs, once the person's dead, there's still this like living image of them that haunts you. And for a long time, Derrida didn't let his picture be taken, and people took it anyway and started publicizing like pictures of himself he hated. So then he started posing for the pictures. So now all the Derrida pictures where he's like posing, that's you know, it's the sign of the times, but it's also his deliberate response to a world that was. What was that, Dave? Were you showing me your head?
No, I was trying to act out the move because he
Oh,
has the
yeah, yeah,
collar
yeah.
is like up and he's kind of like looking over and he kind of looks a little bit like Zoolander.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you there you go.
And they're different on all the books. That one's pretty good too. Little Jacques, little Jackie. Um, The Beast, if you're at all into like animal, thinking about animals, The Beast and the Sovereign is brilliant. I'm not The Beast and the Sovereign. That's brilliant too. But The Animal That Therefore I Am, it's a deconstruction of all the major arguments the Western tradition has given to justify the superiority of humanity over non-human animals. And it's really good. Like that's from teaching Derrida many times over the years, a lot of my students have ended up really loving that one. Um, so that one's pretty accessible.
Did it make you vegan?
No, I don't. Derrida described himself. He said, "I'm a vegetarian who sometimes eats meat."
Okay.
And people laugh at that, and I was always like, "That's right. He's a non-religious vegetarian." Like, there's a lot of people who get into vegetarianism because they want like religious orthodox rituals to follow. They want a kind of paternal figure to tell them how to act and who to be. And if you've deconstructed all that, you could do it. You could still be vegan, but you're going to have a different relationship to it where, yeah, I'm vegetarian, but I'm not vegan.
Cool. Sai has a hand up. I like.
Gla?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for this so far.
Sure.
I have, I guess, two questions. I've kind of avoided, I'm not sure if this is the right order for the questions, but I've kind of avoided Derrida because I can't figure out what we're supposed to do with Derrida. Maybe you can answer that question because
Yeah.
it feels like he's like a thinker of like almost like pure negativity or like you think, he's trying to explain that we're using language to get at something, but we can never really get there.
Yeah.
And that seems like a project that can just end in it just can peter out almost infinitely. So that was kind of my first question. What do we do with Derrida? And then I wondered if you could think of how Deleuze relates to Derrida. Seems like he takes a lot from Derrida, from what I can tell, like the trace. But I'm thinking about Deleuze's concept of the gesture as almost like I'm reading his concept of the gesture, which I think comes from Brecht and Brechtian gestures, where Brecht was this playwright who had his characters would just they'd occasionally just like stop talking or they would just repeat themselves over and over again and they'd do crazy gesticulations with their hands and it's supposed to elicit a kind of response in the viewer that is
Yeah.
beyond language. And
Break down
so
the border between the audience and the stage.
right. And
Yeah.
so for Deleuze, I think the gesture is like a way where you can yes, you're making a gesture towards something repeatedly, so you're not getting there. Language is imperfect, but because you keep making these gestures, these nonverbal breaks to whatever, you can begin to construct something affirmative, but that seems against what Derrida is trying to get at. So I wonder if you could talk to me about that.
Yeah. Oh, those are both great questions and difficult. So, what to do with Derrida is an unanswerable question because if there was a formula, then that would destroy it. Like, it's kind of the response to Derrida is be inspired to go do your own genius thing because that's what he did. Is it? I could see why you'd be worried if you think it's all negativity, and some people have thought that. I think that's more Adorno, but proudly so. But people still find things to do with Adorno. But what was the name? The guy who was the Habermas student at Northwestern, Paul, no, not Paul McCarthy, Tom McCarthy, some McCarthy, and I think he went into God damn, maybe just retired. He wrote a piece called like The Indifference of Difference, which was arguing that difference is the Habermasian question was like, in the name of what do we resist? Like what gives you the traction you need to resist fascism and authoritarian forms of politics and the thought was you need some axiomatic substantive commitment to democracy or egalitarianism or freedom or something that would let you resist that. Derrida is an example of resisting that without any such axiomatic commitment. And it's one of the fascinating things about his politics that he was kind of close to unerringly right. If you look at like his track record on what he sided with, and he was a political leader his whole life, There are very few mistakes, and but no, like the connection between the theory and the practice is often opaque. It's hard to understand how he got there. But part of it is anytime you're against something, you can deconstruct it. This is you can deconstruct Trump easily, but you can also deconstruct Planned Parenthood. So you got to kind of choose your targets wisely. There is something about deconstruction and thinking in general, questioning in general, that doesn't guarantee any preordained outcome. In the last book I was talking about earlier, where he says we have to like rehabilitate a concept of courage that isn't like martial courage, isn't manliness. It's outside of philogocentrism. I don't know if I finished that thought, but in Greek, courage is Andreas, which means manliness. So historically, the concept of courage is connected to a masculinist ideal. And for Derrida, we need to understand that there's no courage without fear. And the greater the courage is, the greater the fear is. And that part of thinking is like facing up to the fear of thinking. Like he says, often when I'm writing, I have this terrible. Actually, he says, when I'm writing, I have no fear at all. He says this in a lot of interviews. Like I'm just kind of I'm following where my thoughts go and playing that out. And later, when I'm done, I think to myself, you must be crazy. How could you say that about those powerful figures or your friends? Or you've just written this brutal critique of, your friend who's going to read this, and how could you do that? But in the writing of it, I felt no fear at all. So courage is a kind of like, it's almost like a Freudian concept where it's like refusing to repress yourself. You're develop your thoughts, you see where they go, and you don't stop if they go in a direction you're uncomfortable with. You keep going and just see where they go. And I think that's a very Nietzschean thought. For Derrida, really, I think the figures that shape the world we're in today are Nietzsche and Heidegger. And the collision of Nietzsche and Heidegger is like an explosion that leads to the plethora of all the theorists we think of, Deleuze and Foucault and you name it. And he is a kind of, as you say, maximally de-axiomized thinker, like a thinker without any substantive view, who's committed to the relentless, ruthless deconstruction of all metaphysical dichotomies. But usually, so one thing you get is deconstruction of all fundamentalisms. All fundamentalisms are grounded in some vision of a substantive commitment that we must all share, and here's why. And that's always implicitly grounded on subordinating a repressed pair in the group that doesn't get talked about, but that, the repression of that other becomes the founding moment of the establishment of the status quo. He talks about that in The Force of Law when there's some, you know, Derrida basically got so famous on the basis of his early works that much of his work is, hey, Derrida, can you come talk to our conference on international relations? And he would say yes. And despite being like terrified of flying, he wouldn't fly. And he's very superstitious. And so he'd take a boat and he wrote Difference. He was on the boat for like weeks. Shows up at the hotel. He's got ideas, but he hasn't written it. And they've put him in the hotel in a room with one bed, and there's another guy in there. So it's like one bed and two guys who don't know each other for the conference. And he says to the guy, like, you can have the bed if you don't mind if I stay up typing. And that's Difference. He writes it in one night. And it's absolutely, to me, when I read that, and it seems like, written for months with a word processor and endlessly revised. In fact, thought about for weeks and months, but written in a mad flow, Kerouac style, you know. Yeah, so I think be inspired is the thought, and if it doesn't inspire you, that's sad. But yeah, that's it happens. You got it's all these thinkers are very hard to read without a teacher. You need a teacher to help give you some tools and define some of the basic terms and then just let you go off on your own and do your own thing. What was the second question about Deleuze?
The second question was if you could compare and contrast Deleuze's difference with Derrida's difference, or like
Yeah.
something because both are thinkers of difference. And so what is a contrast there that's easy to highlight?
Easy to highlight. Well, so you'd have to do a genealogy of difference, right? And the big thinker of difference here again is Heidegger. Ontological difference is one of the central concepts of being and time. And that's the difference between being and entities, or the difference between like chairs and what a chair is, right? And then the difference between what chairs are and what friends are and what justice is and what it means to be anything at all. That's the fundamental ontology, is the question Heidegger's trying to answer in Being and Time. What's it mean to be anything at all? And there's a difference between the meaning of being in general, or fundamental ontology, and all entities. So being and time is, from later Heidegger's perspective and from Derrida's perspective, a work of metaphysics. It's trying to answer the question of being and tell us what isness itself means, what it means to be anything at all. Later Heidegger is radically different than early Heidegger, and it's predicated on the deconstruction of all metaphysics, which Heidegger understands more narrowly than Derrida as onto-theology. That is, attempts to tell us the final story about what being is by grasping its innermost core, or ontology, and its outermost perspective, or theology, and putting those two together. So for Heidegger, these ontotheologies have stabilized these historical epochs or constellations of intelligibility, and we're now in this nihilistic technological one that we need to find our way out and through. So that's the background. Like when you read, Foucault is another important figure in the background of Derrida and Deleuze, and when he's talking about truth regimes or epistemes, these are his like more empirically grounded versions of these ontological ages. So in Deleuze, as far as I understand him, the concept of difference is more abstract. It's sort of like, what's it mean to take differences rather than identities as the founding axioms of your philosophical system. So if you read like Difference and Repetition, that's a very interesting book that, is written in a kind of constant implicit engagement with Heidegger. More than Derrida, I think. It's Heidegger, because they're reading Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures. I mean, Deleuze's Nietzsche lectures are the most brilliant, I think, response to Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures. They're even better. I mean, Derrida's are funnier and shorter, but Deleuze's reading is reading the text of Zarathustra much more carefully than Heidegger read it, and showing how if you read Zarathustra carefully, you'll understand that eternal return is not eternal return of the identical. It's not that I live, I'm born, I live, I die, the earth dies, the universe dies, it all starts over, and I have the exact same life every cosmic cycle. Instead, it's I have every possible life. Every possible different version of life happens. And this one is one of them. And for Nietzsche, there's a finite, this is mathematically incomprehensible, but there's a finite number of possible yous. So, and for Nietzsche, they unfold in a fixed sequence. So there's a kind of sequence of possible yous, and you'll get this exact one again, but only after the finite but huge number of possible yous all get played out. So it's eternal return of the different, really. Eternal return of the same is eternal return of the different. And that's, I think, pretty clearly what Nietzsche's saying, and he says it explicitly in his unpublished notes. Um, and I think Deleuze is picking that up as a critique of Heidegger. So where Heidegger's emphasizing the identity in Nietzsche as the bad thing, for Heidegger, eternal return of the same is expressed as like technological homogenization. So it used to be, you go to Detroit and it's different than Chicago and it's different than Albuquerque. And now you go to any of them, they're all like increasingly have like 20 of the same 100 stores or something. They're all becoming like like mall. It's like you go to the mall and there's the 80 stores, but they're all just,
Or how every rest stop and on the interstate is exactly the same if you go through America, more or
yeah.
less.
Yeah, so that's how, and Heidegger's blaming that on Nietzsche, which is very unfair, I think, and Deleuze is pointing that out. But you also have to see that when Heidegger's blaming that on Nietzsche, that's his way of critiquing the Nazis, the mainstream Nazis that he's trying to transform from within. So it's not fair as a reading of Nietzsche, but it's not entirely ungrounded. There's things in Nietzsche that push in that direction, and the use Heidegger's trying to make of Nietzsche is very different than the use that Deleuze and Derrida and Foucault are trying to make of Nietzsche. It's a different world historical political situation. Heidegger's speaking in a time of triumphant fascist totalitarianism, where there's complete one-party state and all internal enemies are destroyed. What do you do in that situation? And Deleuze and Foucault and Derrida are speaking in post-war France in the aftermath of the war and the search for the struggle between capitalism and communism on the one hand and the search for a third alternative. And both Foucault and Deleuze, with their projects of mental health reform, the reform of the institution, the asylum, that's more the stuff with Guattari in Deleuze, but that's in Foucault too, very clearly. So that's coming. It's like projects of personal liberation can motivate your deconstruction. Why does Foucault focus on, prisons? Because he was imprisoned by a system that told him, when he was like 15, the headmaster called him into his office and said, like, "Hey, Michel, it's come to my attention that you've got some real deep problems. You're one of those people. You've got those attractions to the same sex, but don't worry, there's new technologies now. We can help. We can fix you. And, we're going to use psychiatry and the latest sciences to try and normalize you." And that becomes a kind of profound libidinal motivation that Foucault never talks about. You have to kind of read it off his biography, for the trajectory of his critical works and what's motivating the specific targets he picks as an engaged intellectual, engaged theorist. So I think we can do the same thing. It just kind of depends on your toolkit and what strikes you as the most important issues for your time and generation, for you and for you and your generation. Like the stuff that matters, you can't just pick up on something that matters to other people but doesn't matter to you. It's got to matter to you and to your generation, unless you can make it matter to you somehow. One battle after another style. If you've seen that film, I just watched it the other day. It's interesting because Leo's character is kind of like co-opted into the revolution by a libidinal desire for a woman, I think is the implied backstory. But it ends up shaping him in a way that is ambivalent, I think, for good and for ill.
That's definitely true of Deleuze. His brother was a war hero, and his parents obsessively loved his brother and didn't care anything for him. Didn't think that any of his intellectual work was worth anything. I think that's probably, he doesn't talk about it, but I have to imagine that's why he focused so much on making something of his philosophy that, as he said, was going to birth a new type of thinker. But it's like that can also become reductive, right? I don't know for sure, but I have to imagine that plays a role. But yeah, I think at least for me, it'd have to be all this stuff about LLMs and the idea that plausible tranches of human speech can credibly take the place of style and meaning. Yeah, so I'm excited to think with Derrida on this.
I just wrote this. So yeah, I mean it's Heidegger on technology's danger and promise in the age of AI. Because Heidegger has been the most consistent philosophical springboard for the critiques of AI, from Dreyfus through today, I think. The people doing even the guy, what's his name, the third of the three guys who got the Turing Award for their deep language modeling, the one who's now just started his own AI company. Like the two guys are saying like, humanity's doomed. But then there's the third guy who says like, no, the LLMs just missed something essential about the human. But he's trying to capture that by making embodied LLMs now, which is interesting. But I argue in this book basically that, you won't have anything like us until you have things that care. They have to give a shit, as Hoagland said. Things have to matter to them, and nothing matters to an LLM. And it's hard to understand how it could matter to something that doesn't care about anything, has no pain or pleasure or joy or suffering, or how could anything matter?
Well, it's strange too because even the ones that are supposedly customer service oriented, like I had a crazy experience with the Substack AI, where basically it told me things to reassure me and make me feel better that were imaginary. And like one of them was that someone would email me to help with my technical problem. And then when I went back and I was like, nobody
Uh,
contacted me, the bot was like, well, yeah, I shouldn't have said that. That was never going to happen. And I had
my
no way
bad.
of,
Yeah,
yeah, it's just like, wow. So then, so
so
even if
evil.
it's supposed to, there's some sort of like care or service or support that I'm supposed to experience from, but the only thing it can do is create this very strange, superficial, like imitation or mimicry
Yeah,
of the actual experience of like fixing someone's problem.
right. And anyone, so I've got a kid who's got a lot of issues, and we've spent untold hours dealing with insurance companies and stuff. And what you learn from that as two PhDs having trouble struggling with the intricacies of a bureaucracy designed to deny you coverage or whatever is that the only way you ever get help is by escalating till you finally get to the human who's like the Mr. Incredible in The Incredibles, who like knows the Byzantine inner workings of the system and can tell you what you need to do to get your coverage. And it's like when you have some problem with your computer and you got to escalate to the person who can actually solve it. Those people are gone. Those were the white collar workers that, Doge came in and fired from at least all the government things. So they've deliberately set up bureaucracies that now not only have these Byzantine apparatuses to deny people coverage and make it almost impossible to get it back, but they've eliminated the people who would have been the ones who could have successfully helped you get it back. And they did it not just to save money, but also to install, their own LLMs in the position of the white collar workers who had those high paying jobs as state workers, and to take that information and like bring it over to Palantir, right? So they're making money on selling the product of streamlining, selling the LLMs they put in the place of the humans who they fired by LLM. So you don't even have to bring in like a headhunter or whatever it's called, corporation, to be the ones who fire the people, so you don't have to do it. That's all just done by AIs now. And then finally to steal the information and sell it to the really evil group that's using it to like direct ICE in where to go to arrest people.
Yeah,
And
that reminds me. Dave's got some interesting writing or thoughts about the loss of skilled workers and them being replaced by like basically they're trained to be yes men. They're trained to be the hall monitors effectively, and so they lack the actual skill, but they make
yeah,
up for it in being sycophantic and rule followers. It reminds me of there's a quote from Stanley Aronowitz, which was something like, "In the future, the most powerful people will be the people who can repair the computers." And there's a scene in Cronenberg's film, Crimes of the Future, where I don't know if you've seen it or if anybody's seen it, but there's this just chilling scene where this revolutionary gets executed by a drill to the head of some basically glorified tech representatives. And I don't know, I just think that's definitely where we're headed for sure. They're trying to formalize it all into this computer, and then they're hollowing out the structure, the ladder that made it possible. There's no one to escalate to. If the 90s were stand by, your call is very important to us, it's now your call is not important to anyone. there isn't
well,
there isn't
it's
anyone.
it's gonna say in a very human sounding voice, your call is very important to us, and we'll get right back to you. And then it's gonna have been a hallucination, right? So the good news is it won't work. Like this won't work, and it's always the question, like when the system is designed to fail, to like starve the poor so that the rich can get richer. At what point does the massive creation of unhappiness, poverty, suffering build up to catalyze actual change? And within the constraints of our political system, it's a problem because, you get like the damage done by the current administration in such a short amount of time is like hard to see how that can be undone in anything less than decades. So any party that comes in and wins now is not going to be able to fix things equally fast. I mean, it's much easier to break things than fix them. And as a result, there's going, people, this is as Plato said, the problem with democracy is the masses are asses and they're easily manipulated by the charismatic demagogue who just says whatever resonates with the group in order to get power. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting negative, but the good side is that it won't work. So like the AIs, the real danger, as I say in the book, isn't that the AIs are going to become super intelligent and save us or enslave us Hollywood style. The real danger is that we're going to lower expectations about ourselves and each other to the level of them. So we're going to become as dumb as the computers. That's the danger. And I think if that doesn't happen, what will happen is there'll be a counter reaction against the fantasies of super intelligent AI, which is a total fantasy. It's no different. It's different in type, but not in kind from the fantasies of, from 1950s on. AI was always a decade away. True AI, which now means something like super intelligence.
Oh, they're absolutely goalpost moving. Yeah. Well, this has been really great. Thank you so much, Ian. I
Sure.
wonder if anybody else that's in the chat has any questions before we close out,
I
probably sometime top of the
I
hour here.
I just have one thing related to AI since you guys went there. I don't know. Did anybody see the reel that's been making the rounds? I thought it was real for a few days, but then I did a little digging and I found out this was satirical, but it's of a woman pastor or priest giving a homily or sermon, and she's reading from a sheet of paper this homily on mercy, and then she says she's reading it and she's all, if you'd like, I can also show one small rhetorical tweak that guarantees even your densest congregate won't miss the point. And then she stops and she starts, and then everyone's all amen, and they all just clap.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's shocking to me that you thought it was real. So it's gotten to the point where even people like you who are super skilled at the virtual are getting fooled. What hope do the rest of us have?
Yeah, and the knock-on effect of that is like the fact that deepfakes exist. Just wait, very soon the government's going to be like, "Oh, we'll disavow that. That's a deepfake." Just because
Right.
the
They
because the
already are.
technology is so strong already. Yeah,
Well, and the reverse Stalinism of manufacturing the crime to fit the sentence. Like we want to get rid of that person. Here's the deep fake of their crime that becomes the pretext for us arresting them. Yeah, no, I've got students already who have like been fired for complete pretexts and even though in the long run they'll win their court cases, it's still like career destroying. It's dark times.
Kira Kira asked if Asuru had a question that got missed, and I just wanted to highlight his comment from earlier when you were talking about Rede. He wrote Redes of the Lost Ark.
Rada, Rada the Lost Ark. Yeah, nice. Very nice. The Lost
Yeah.
Ark. And arc is a concept in Merleau-Ponty. God, what is it? The intentional arc. And that's Merleau-Ponty's version of Rada. So for Heidegger, Rada is like I translate it as conversance because it's like you're conversant how to sit in a chair and how to turn on a computer and move a mouse and use a trackpad. That's how you articulate the intelligible. In Merleau-Ponty, it's like the way in which we skillful beings in the midst of these life worlds try to maintain an equilibrium. Like we're constantly adjusting to try and find the balance that feels comfortable. And that's the intentional arc. So you could have Rada of the Lost Ark. That would be Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty.
It's
Or
a
Ark
book.
of the Lost Rada. My first paper was called Silence of the Limbs. And it was looking at Silence of the Lambs and the forgetting of the body and of death in the Silence of the Lambs. That was my first publication last century, back when it was still career suicide to write about film, especially horror.
Nice. Well, I want to let you go as we come up against the time here. I don't know if you have time for one more. It looks like Yasuru did share one down below. He said, I was going to ask about what Derrida was working on when he died.
Good question. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the seminars is that in some technical sense, they were one unbroken seminar. Like each one would end with him saying, and next year we will continue this, right? So this one ends with him saying, and next year we'll. So it breaks off in the middle of a seminar that he's been teaching his whole career. He taught it in Paris and then Irvine and then New York. I think twice in New York. So like the longest version was Paris. He would do his own translation for Irvine. That was my favorite because he didn't get like once Peggy Camuff and all the eloquent French translators got their hands on it, it became, more like a high level prose. But he himself was translating it and he would apologize for his English, but it was better than 99.9% of people's English. So, and it was clearer. So just like a lot of philosophers, he was very clear as a teacher. And I was going to say, like, while I was always hearing him as talking about Heidegger, there were 500 people in the room, and the people next to me were hearing just talking about Marx or just talking about feminism or just talking about animals. Like the French style that he used because of the philosophemes or the tropes, it was trope centric. Like we're going to look at the images of the stranger across all these texts and contexts, made it so that you could be working on like Heidegger and the stranger, the animal as stranger, migrant as stranger, sans papier as stranger. So it had this kind of open-endedness that allowed it to connect to so much. It was part of, I think, the fecundity of it and why it was so exciting was almost everyone found it something that helped inspire new thoughts in their own work. It wasn't like, go be a Derridian. It was like, here's some new questions you can pose in the stuff you're already doing.
I think that's a great place here to cut it off. And so I just want to say thank you for joining us. This was awesome.
You're welcome. Glad to be a part of it. Keep me posted.
Thank you.
Will do.
All right. See you
Awesome.
later.
Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
You too. Bye.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment. Theory Underground has been around long enough at this point that we have people joining who say, I was watching Theory Underground for 1.5 to 2, sometimes 3 years before I decided to join. That's really cool. It's amazing that there's a good handful of people out there in the world who get something from this kind of super niche content. It's not easy, doing stuff that is this niche in this part of the internet because all of the algorithmic incentives would have me just pumping out more and more and more of the same thinkers, the same thinkers, whatever's trendy, whatever has a bunch of people showing up to talk about it at conferences or whatever. But I like to take a much wider and longer view of the situation and think a lot deeper about who's going to help us really think through the moment. And I like to draw on those people that are the best for thinking about the situation, not just the most popular. And so in that vein, though, Intro to Theory, it's a course unlike any other. What you just saw was Intro to Nietzsche. I've already done Intro to Marx, part of which is up on the channel for free subscribers. But if you become a member at Theory Underground, you get access to the full version of that, as well as the upcoming lecture on Heidegger that I'll be giving. There's also going to be an upcoming lecture on Heidegger by Simon Critchley, the absolute legend. We've got a whole bunch of amazing guest lecturers for Intro to Theory throughout the year lined up, and there's going to be a bunch of other thinkers. We're going to be getting into Lacan and Levinas and Bourdieu and Baudrillard, and we've got guest lectures on Burke and McLuhan and all kinds of other thinkers like Luhmann and stuff like that. So I if you're interested in any of this that's been going on at Theory Underground and you want to get more involved, then now's the time. If you've been watching this stuff for a while and you keep thinking, I might do this, well, now's a good time to be doing it, because Intro to Theory is an awesome on-ramp. And it's happening at the exact same time that we're doing Philosophy of Stewardship. Not at the exact same time. Philosophy of Stewardship happens on the first Sunday of every month. And then Intro to Theory usually happens on the third Saturday of every month. But then we have guest lectures. And also for members, there's a monthly office hours where you can ask me anything and kind of talk about your projects. Then there is, for gold members and higher, a special thing called Reclaim Writing Workshop, as well as Lecture Bootcamp Workshop. So if that sounds interesting, if you want to develop yourself as a writer, as a speaker, this is an amazing opportunity to get involved. And finally, if you want to get involved at the platinum level, this is a great way to develop a project, whether that be a book, a blog, or something else. The Projectus Cohort 2026 is ongoing. It's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. Get involved now, theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Finally, just your last reminder here, I made a game. Canon TCG, the liberal arts trading card game, and Canon Fest, the official launch of the first edition of this game, is going to be at the end of August at the same time as TUCon 2026. Apply now. Spots are going fast. This thing will fill out. And it has always been an absolute blast to do stuff in person. Everybody has always loved it. We've never had any problems or complaints. And so if you want to be a part of this thing, it's going to be really great. We've been doing it for 3 years. It's just getting better. Let's go. Let's go. Hope to see you there.
All right, everybody. That was great. That was awesome. Glad we got that. You know what I want to highlight? I mentioned to a couple of you about how good lectures, you get concepts. He gave us 6 solid concepts today: deconstruction, difference, ontology, inevitability, destinarity, and phallogocentrism, as well as all of this being a critique of onto-theology. So that was like a bonus concept because it comes from Heidegger. And I think we got a couple other Heideggerian bonus concepts. So it's just like, I love it. So that was awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. This was great. This was a fantastic lecture. Really like Ian.
Oh, and Sai, I wanted to say something about what to do with it. Because,
Yeah. So same thing.
Derrida's-
Obviously, it's the same problem I have with Adorno sometimes.
Right. And so Derrida is definitely anti-instrumentalization, as is Adorno. But for my own purposes, I can instrumentalize Derrida to some extent, I think. I haven't done it explicitly. I think it's just had a creep effect. But like the way I think of the gerrymandering of dispositions and Befindlichkeit and attunement and duopoly and all of the, in that lecture where I did gerrymandering Befindlichkeit, the whole thing is like a bunch of different opposite terms. And the thing is like these opposite terms, they break down. And so I think that the initial idea of that came to me probably in a film class a long time ago, probably taught by Lloyd Duman, if I can remember correctly. And he was giving like a sort of cheap Derrida take to a bunch of freshmen. And I remember just being like, huh. And then it just grew on me over time. And so the way it cashes out though, is just like, you start to see these frameworks where you're like, everything this person's about saying and doing doesn't make sense outside of reference to this framework that they are assuming. And if you actually try to get them to explain what they mean by these words that really hold down this framework, they don't have very good understandings of what they're actually referring to. And it seems like it's some cultural hand-me-down that they just kind of picked up along the way. That doesn't mean that it leads to the deconstruction of just like, well, there is no bottom to this anymore. In a lot of cases, I think you can basically deconstruct the either the elite or everyman version of a term, and then you can like say, well, what would be the best? What would be the better, the stronger version of that? And so that's a more reconstructive effort that Derrida doesn't partake in, but his mode really, like, I think helps people enter into the first step of that process. They just don't usually take the what I'm calling second step.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that in your work. Definitely the post-duopoly stuff, the critique of the schooling system, definitely. Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, like I'm thinking already, like, oh, you want to go to college? Why? Because you want a good education, right? Oh, because you want to avoid working with your hands. Oh, why do you want to avoid working with your hands? Oh, is it a hellish nightmare to imagine, having to get your hands dirty or whatever? It's like, where do your things come from, etc. You can break down someone's virtue signaling about how it's good to have a college education like fairly easily using these kinds of the Derridian concepts or whatever.
Yeah, and then right there, you can also flip it back again onto the person who's like thinks that the work is noble, but then it's like, but is it noble? Who are you actually working for? What is it actually doing? Who is this corporation? Is it really your time? Is it really your money? Where is your surplus labor? But that obviously, to some extent you get that from Marx, but it's a Derridian mode. And so I really like the fact that he said, the last Derridian was Derrida. And you get all these people, when they call themselves Derridians, really what that means is they write papers about things they're interested in, and he is like the person that they read. And so it's, they usually don't read a whole lot of other theory outside of their favorite guy. But when they're doing a really good job, though, what they keep alive is the spirit of that mode itself. And it's just like, yeah, being able to enter into that mode, I think, is like an important part of thinking. And that this is where Zizek is right. That is Hegelian. Like Derrida is when he's at his best, he's super Hegelian. And this is For They Know Not What They Do. There's a whole chapter on that by Zizek. And I would have liked to bring that up with Tom.
Yeah,
I would have liked to bring that up with Thomson if I had the time, but oh well.
Yeah, like it seems like Derrida and Hegel are both definitely Heracliteans. I've been reading like all the fragments recently, going through the history of philosophy, and yeah, all of his examples, like the liar, which is kind of a weird example, but he's effectively saying like things are in tension at all times, and there's no way to get outside that tension. Yeah, definitely see the confluence there.
Yeah, man. And the book I was trying to remember earlier, where I was saying I think that there's like a dense theoretical little treatise on how to do this thing. I did find it. It's disseminations, and so I'll have to ask Iain about disseminations next time we get a chance to talk to him.
Add it to my list. Yeah. I have the Beast and the Sovereign too. I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, disseminations would be like a condensed little piece, whereas the Beast and the Sovereign, obviously you have it, so you already know it's a thick one, but it's very approachable because it's his spoken words, and so that's one of the reasons I think it's so loved by people. It's like kind of like Bourdieu with his seminars. It's like it might be the best place you can find him. Actually, the seminar really becomes the key to the written work of pretty much every French theorist.
Very good. Well, Felix just woke up from a fraught nap, so I will sign off. Fantastic lecture.
All right.
Thanks, Dave.
Yep. Have a good one, guys. Peace.